We're back reviewing a budget case today. This is the Thermaltake Versa J24. It comes in at about $70, plus or minus a bit, because you can get the ARGB version, which we don't have, for an extra couple of bucks, extra $10 plus. But we have the non-ARGB version, so it's a bit cheaper, and that is generally a good thing on our bench because we're looking more at the value in this price range for how well does it cool, how well does it do acoustically versus nearby competitors, and then of course to some extent how is the exterior and how is the build quality. So today we're looking at Thermaltake's J24, and this is one of the cases that was tucked away hidden at a recent trade show. So we'll see if it was hidden for good reason or not. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Gigabyte Aorus AD27QD gaming monitor. The AD27QD is a 27-inch 1440p gaming display with 95% of DCI-P3 color saturation for high color accuracy, accompanied by a 1 millisecond response time, 10-bit IPS panel, and display HDR Visa certification. Additional features include fluid adjustment and slide, RGB LEDs for personal flair, and firmware features like cooldown counters, reticles, and adaptive noise reduction. Learn more at the link below. So the J24 ARGB, not this one, we have RGB. There's one last letter. The ARGB version and also a whole bunch of other new Commander Series products were at CES this year, and a lot of them were tucked away in a back room, which we were fortunate enough to find because the main product showcased was water-cooled memory, which is just, let's move on. So the cases were hidden in the back, and it caught us by surprise because the cases that Thermaltake had hidden in the back were pretty damn good. They were competitive, and a lot of them did have mesh fronts. This is one of the ones that has a bit of a denser panel on the front, but it is still perforated for airflow more than a lot of cases on the market, so this obviously caught our attention. And we spoke to Thermaltake about it and said, you know, you shouldn't feel ashamed about trying to do things with airflow and fans. So anyway, hopefully we've talked some sense into them and they'll show these things more proudly in the future. But the J24 does have a couple of things that as you dig into it, you go, well, maybe it's not quite as open air as we thought, but we'll see how it does in the thermal section later in this video. For example, this one has effectively two filters. There's the outer mesh, which isn't much of a filter. It is it's a mesh, and it's probably about 50% metal still. And then the inner section got the honeycomb design just for structural support, and then there's a really fine filter in there. So when we saw this with the G21, another Thermaltake case that we'll talk about today, what we found was that the G21 tripled up on filters, and as a result, really hindered its ability to cool well. And then as you removed those filters one by one, the thermal performance improved to a point where it became rather competitive. So this, because it's something that you can mostly achieve on your own by pulling a few tabs and pulling the filter out, it's not such a bad thing. You just need to be aware of the difference it makes thermally and maybe spend some more time cleaning your case internally once you remove the filter. So we're gonna take that out today and test it and see how it does. But beyond that, it does have 3 fans in the front. These are not particularly high static pressure, which will come into play with the double filters here later, but 3 fans nonetheless, and they are RGB in this model. There's an ARGB one, as I said, elsewhere if you want it. There's 1 fan in the back. It is about the cheapest fan that Thermaltake could possibly buy, but it's still a fan. So you end up with 4 kind of lowish end to maybe medium on the front end fans. Can't have a medium end, but you get what I'm saying. And that's not so bad for $70. It starts to compete with the likes of the RL06, which has long been a chart topper on our bench from SilverStone, and other cases in that price category. The Fractal Meshify C is another case that sells around this price point, fewer fans included, but still set up in a way that you can really get it going for airflow if you wanted to. So it's a $70 case. It is RGB focused. It comes with the fans that have RGB built in. It's got a lot of things that are popular right now and a relatively low price. Now we just need to talk about if it's actually any good. So we're gonna go through Patrick's build notes, and then we'll go through the thermal section. There are, I will note, as just a prequel or precursor here, Patrick is fairly critical in the build section, and we are actually overall leaning slightly positive on this case, but there's a lot of critical points to go through, so let's go through those now. The Versa J24 TG RGB edition is a budget case from Thermaltake. Our understanding is that the J22, 23, 24, and 25 are basically the same chassis with the same number of fans and different front panels, but trying to remember Thermaltake's case SKUs is a great way to go crazy. The sample they sent us for review specifically is the RGB edition and not the newer ARGB edition, which may or may not have been a mistake on Thermaltake's part, but saving $10 over an extra vowel is a win in our book. The case interior is just big enough to fit an ATX motherboard with little room to spare on any side, but there are adequate cutouts along the front edge to route all the cables. The case is about as small as it can be without entering Q500L territory, almost exactly the same dimension as the Meshify C, but slightly longer. Cable management room is understandably restricted as a result of this. There is space under the power supply shroud, but users with one or more 3.5-inch drives will struggle to find place for power cables. The hard drive cage can be removed or shifted 2.5 centimeters back toward the rear of the case, a welcome change from budget cases that usually rigid the hard drive cage in place. The top of the power supply shroud is fully ventilated and includes two mounting points for 2.5-inch drive sleds, which can be placed behind the motherboard as well. That's where we installed ours, because the mounts on the power supply shroud don't line up with any cable cutouts. To be usable at all, the SATA cables would need to be plugged directly into the motherboard instead of being routed neatly under the shroud, which is a minor ding against the case. The only major fit and finish issue with the case was that it only had 7 motherboard standoffs installed and no spares included. We'll give Thermaltake the benefit of the doubt and assume this was a QC oversight and problem, but the manual confirms that there aren't any extra standoffs included in the parts kit in this case. This happens, but it really shouldn't, and it should have backups in case it does. Missing 2 of 9 standoffs with a full-sized ATX board means that some of the board is going to flex unavoidably when components are installed. We have dozens of extra standoffs lying around, so not really a big deal, but it could be an inconvenience for first-time system builders, especially those with a bit more OCD or need to do it the right way than those who can get by without a couple of extra screws. The steel side panel is held on with metal tabs, a mechanism as annoying as it is old. It's the kind with loops instead of the fragile little hooks, at least, so that's one good side of it. The glass side panel, however, is much better. It's got a couple of metal strips glued to the edges that hook over the chassis and are secured with thumb screws at the back. This is probably cheaper than drilling holes in the glass panel for the thumb screws, a process we showed in our tempered glass factory tour, and although relying on glue is less secure technically, it's easier to use for the user, and it's unlikely to fail. We haven't had one fail yet. The front panel is covered with the same pill-shaped ventilation holes as on the Core G21, but backed with a sheet of foam to filter out dust. The effectiveness of the filter is slightly undercut by a cutout under the front panel, which allows air directly into the fans, but since the fans are mounted nearly flush with the front panel, most of the air is still pulled through the front of the case. The resemblance of the front panel to the G21 is ominous. We criticized that case for using multiple redundant filters that choked off the airflow. The J24's approach makes a lot more sense, but it also blocks off a lot of the incoming air, as we'll discuss in the thermal section later. The top of the front panel is decoratively narrowed in a way that seems like it would prevent mounting 140mm fans, but the panel is still 140mm wide at its narrowest point, although the 140mm fan mounts don't extend all the way to the top of the case. The fan LEDs are controlled externally by a button on the front of the case labeled R, originally for reset, but now for RGB. The power and RGB switches are under either side of a single plastic button, which is sort of a bad choice and one that can't be saving Thermaltake much money or time. It's not as bad as having the power and reset switches under the same button as was the original intent, but it's still going to be annoying to hit the wrong switch in the dark. The fans use the same 5-pin connector that we've seen and complained about in the past with Lian Li cases, since they can't connect to anything except the hub that ships with the case. Thermaltake's fan hub is extremely simple, to the extent that it doesn't have any way to actually control the speed of the fans, which therefore run at full RPM, with no way to control their speed short of soldering together a 4-pin adapter. The connections on the hub are tailored exactly to the fans that ship with the case, and there are no spare plugs. The J24 ships with 4 fans, a massive improvement over the G21's single fan, despite our hang-ups about how they're connected and controlled. The 3 intake fans are RGB. Not ARGB on this case, that's a different SKU, but it does exist, and they can accept lighting input directly from the fan hub or passed through from a compatible motherboard. The foam filter does have an interesting softening effect on the lighting compared to a more typical mesh front filter, but the metal and plastic elements of the front panel also obscure the fans a good bit. The front of the case theoretically supports up to 360mm radiators, but only tubes up, and there may be clearance issues with the hard drive cage unless it's moved back or taken out. Ignore any marketing photos with a radiator mounted at the top of the case. Thermaltake doesn't even try to claim that the top mount supports radiators in their spec sheet, since there's only about 3 centimeters of space between the motherboard and the case. There's room for one 120mm rear radiator and one 240 in the front without any crowding though. We followed the standard test suite for the J24 with just a couple of exceptions. We gave up almost immediately on trying to noise normalize this system, since the rear fan is the only one that can be controlled and is the quietest of the four. The front fans are not cross-compatible with the Lian Li 5-pin fan controller either, despite using the exact same connector. And if users can't practically lower the fan speed, there's no point in us trying to force that scenario for testing. We also added a test with a foam filter layer removed to see how much it restricted the airflow, and one final test with the rear exhaust fan controlled via the motherboard header instead of the fan controller. We won't discuss that one too much because it's within half a degree for thermal results. Thermal testing will start with just the Versa J24 case results, then we'll expand the charts. The CPU torture average temperature is 57.1 degrees Celsius over ambient, which lowered massively down to 44.4 degrees delta T over ambient with the front panel removed, for a reduction of about 13 degrees Celsius. The intake fans don't deal well at all with the task of drawing air through a foam filter and through the front panel, but if they're unrestricted, they do an excellent job of pushing enough air through the case to get it towards the top of the results. Leaving the front panel on and removing just the foam filter confirmed this, with a CPU temperature of 48.8 degrees Celsius over ambient, almost as good as with no panel at all. Users who aren't averse to cleaning their cases should definitely consider removing the dust filter in the front, as these fans aren't particularly good with static pressure performance. Comparatively, 57.1 degrees stock isn't a completely terrible score to begin with. It's close to the defined S2 levels of performance, but it's definitely on the warm end of the scale and is especially warm for the fan count. It's certainly not as good as we'd expect for a mesh-fronted case with 4 stock fans for its placement. The G21 with two 140mm intake fans added, in addition to the stock 120mm exhaust fan, placed 51.8 degrees delta T in this test, and the J24 would be right alongside it if it had either a less restrictive filter or fans with higher static pressure. If you're willing to remove the front filter, performance improves significantly and scales toward the very top end of the chart. GPU thermals for the J24 are next. GPU temperature was 56.2 degrees on average in the torture test, and it too got much cooler with the front panel removed, averaging 48.5 degrees over ambient. This also gives us an additional clock increase in boosting behavior, which is maybe notable in some instances. The ventilated power supply shroud matters more here than it typically does, since the incoming air from the lowest intake fan is directed into the power supply shroud and has no place to exit other than upwards straight into the GPU cooler. Removing the front filter and keeping the front panel landed at the midpoint between the two results at 52 degrees average. Again, removing the foam filter layer is a valid option for users who don't mind cleaning their GPU fans more than usual. 56.2 degrees over ambient is comparatively worse than the CPU temperatures were on the level of the stock defined R6, and definitely hotter than it could be. So just in terms of the stack versus other cases, it's on the warm side once again. The G21 with two added fans also did nearly the same here, resulting in 56.9 degrees over ambient, but we'd like to see the J24 closer to something like the SilverStone RL06 or something similar. 52 degrees without the filter does put it on the level of the stock H500P mesh, which isn't bad, but you do have to remove that filter. The Firestrike Extreme test raised GPU temperature slightly above the torture test's result to 58.6 degrees Celsius over ambient, putting it among the results of cases where the GPU hits 82 to 83 degrees and downclocks to maintain its temperature. It's not the worst GPU temperature we've seen with this bench, but it absolutely qualifies as hot, because if we're hitting 82 to 83 degrees, it's really sort of getting into unacceptable levels. It would be better if the filter weren't so restrictive, or if you just remove it, but then you do lose some of the dust filtration. This is a similar issue to what we talked about with the G21, just not quite as bad. We can't make our usual comments about adding a fan to better cool the GPU either, since Thermaltake already has as many fans as possible in the front of the case, so you'd just be replacing fans at this point, which is a valid option, as seen in our earlier test results with just the CPU and just the GPU versus only the Versa J24 results. Adding or changing the fans to better ones does improve performance significantly. Blender rendering on the CPU averaged 38.7 degrees Celsius over ambient, still in the middle of the chart and next to the Define S2 Vision and stock NZXT H500. If a case is going to be running 3 to 4 fans at full speed at all times, no matter what, it should at least be cooling exceptionally well. It's not that the case performs poorly stock, it's that it should be doing better, and it can be. Rendering on the GPU averaged 27.8 degrees Celsius over ambient, equivalent to the LandCool 1, which is a case that we haven't really mentioned in months. The bottom of the case is about as good as it can be for GPU cooling with the constraints of the case and having a power supply shroud and a hard drive cage, but it's let down by the front panel. For noise, up next, we measured the J24 at 39.5 dBA. Again, there's no way to control 3 of the 4 fans in the case, and the 4th one can't be controlled either unless it's plugged into the motherboard. That means 39.5 dBA is going to be the limiting noise level for our test bench. And this will change based on your system, but when you can't control the fans, there's definitely a floor to how low your noise can go. Per Patrick's wording then, in his written review that's linked in the description below, I'll just quote him directly. It might not sound like it, but we actually like this case. And the reason that Patrick liked this is because it's $80 to $90. It's supposed to be a bit cheaper sometimes, but currently at current prices, at the time of recording this review, it is $90 on Newegg, which is overpriced. It's $80 on most other outlets, and we've heard $70 is a possibility as well. So the ARGB version is on sale on Newegg for about $10 over what they've got. What this is supposed to be priced. That's at $90 on Newegg, typically a bit more. 80 is a pretty good price. We'd like to see it again as it falls closer to 70, that's good. But 80 is not bad for a case with 4 fans. It's just that the fans aren't particularly powerful. They look kind of good if you're into the RGB thing, so there's some value there for a lot of people. And they perform well enough, but the case really starts to push high towards the top of the charts when you strip down the front a bit. So if you take that filter out, it is one of the better cases in its price category. It's up there, not distant from the RL06 in some of our tests, and that's a good thing. So if you're willing to sacrifice some of the dust filtration in favor of performance, the case sets you up well for that. Separately, the case is really small, so it's got that potentially going for it as well. It's not too far from the Q500L size. It's a bit bigger, and it's very, very similar to the Fractal Meshify C size. And this is a good category to target because it's largely underserved. Other than the size of the enclosure, there's one downside with that, which is that there's not particularly good liquid cooling support, but if you're leaning towards spending less on a case, you might be spending less on cooling and probably getting air more likely. An example of where it's limited is the top. So Thermaltake does not advertise top radiator support, although in some of their marketing photos, there's a radiator in there, but it looks like it's a render. So don't go into this planning to put a rad on the top. You can get one in the front, so it's got some minimal level of liquid cooling support. You can do a small, like a 120 in the back, depending. Make sure you double check, but depending on the radiator. So it's not particularly good in that regard, but it's small, and that's the upside, the counter to it. So here's where we land with this then. The next step up in build quality would be something like the Meshify C. It's not far in price. It's around the same price actually, but you would want to buy an additional 1 to 2 fans to really get the performance out of the Meshify C that it deserves to have. So that is a bit of a hidden cost there. This case, if you buy extra fans, we replaced 4 with 3 good fans, and it performed better by a couple degrees actually, and that's in the earlier results in the CPU and GPU only charts. So you can improve it. But once you start stacking up fan costs, you get rid of the RGB stuff, you're kind of getting a bit bad on the value because there's more expensive cases that come out the same with the fan cost added that will match performance. But it's something you could do. So yeah, the main competitors here, the case is actually overall not bad. There's clearly some downsides. It's a cheaper case. There's some static pressure issues with these fans versus the front panel. The front panel is better than the G21. Thermaltake has improved on that point. They've gone down from 3 filters by 1, reduction of 1. So that's an improvement in thermals too. There were some QC issues we found that we discussed earlier, but not major ones. So existence of 7 standoffs instead of 9 with no spares, which is kind of stupid. Hopefully it only happens on ours, but we'll see. Let us know. Yeah, primary competitors. If you wanted to look around for other things, maybe you want to widen your options and consider stuff in addition to this one, you look at the Fractal Meshify C, add in the cost of 1 to 2 fans, and it's pretty good. You can look at the now pretty aging SilverStone RL06, getting harder to find these days, but still a very good case. If you want to get a bit more spendy, you can go up towards the H500 non-P from Cooler Master. Just to be clear, there's a lot of H500s, and that one is about $100 on average. Very competitive case. The NZXT H500 has a much different approach to all of these. It's more closed off, but depending on your configuration, if it's like this one, not terrible in performance because of the way the negative pressure setup is configured. So that H500 also not bad to look at, and that should set you up for overall pretty good options. The Corsair 400C, if it's still available, is another good one in the $90 to $100 range. So that'll give you a full list to kind of start with, and then you can expand from there. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly, like by buying one of these shirts. This is the anniversary edition logo with the teardown components in it, or one of our mod mats. You can also go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to get the newest behind the scenes video. Thank you for watching. Oh, and we'll be in Taipei in about a week for Computex. So get subscribed to catch that coverage, or stay tuned if you already are. I'll see you all next time.